Hi guys, welcome back to True Crime and Tea, where we sip the tea and we dive into true crime cases, looking at it through an academic lens. I am your host Lily, and if you like true crime, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, because we release videos every single Wednesday and we'd love to have you as part of our community. So today's case, we are delving into the mind and chilling case of Robledo Puch. I think I'm saying it right. Puch is how his name is pronounced. Robledo Puch. He was Argentina's angel of death, whose youthful facade masked the deadly predator that he was. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch was the greatest mass murderer of criminal history in Argentina. From here on, I'm just going to call him Carlos because that was his name. Carlos was born in 1952 in Buenos Aires, and from an early age he exhibited signs of antisocial behavior. Carlos was born on the 19th of January 1952 to Victor Robledo, who was a former technician for General Motors, and Josefa Ida Habendak, who was a housewife who had immigrated from Germany shortly after World War II. In 1956, when Carlos was 4 years old, his parents moved the family to Borges Street, Olivos, in Buenos Aires, where they rented the first floor apartment above a hardware store. Now, coming from a hard-working middle-class family, Carlos was known to be quite shy and quiet, a bit like his mother, and his mum took great care of him. So he didn't come from that tumultuous background that we have known in the last few stories. He was able to study the piano when he was growing up, and he learnt German through his childhood, which his mom was German, so you would assume he was able to learn German. But as the years went on, Carlos had somewhat of a troubled school experience as a victim of bullying and having a little bit more of a difficult relationship with his father. You can kind of see where the troubles may have started. So while his mum took great care of him, his father's relationship and his relationship wasn't that strong. And then obviously he was bullied at school. Then he started getting into a bit of issue when he started stealing from his classmates. And then finally he was expelled from school when he was found to be stealing money from the school's secretary's office. In December of 1968, Carlos had his first legal encounter when he entered a workshop of a man who worked with bicycles, and he stole a motorcycle. Now, he was born in 1952, which means he was 16 at this time. And after he was arrested for this robbery, Carlos actually then admitted to 14 other thefts that he had committed. So he was a very busy bee in his later childhood and teen years, and he was eventually sentenced to reformatory school, where he spent 20 days under the order of a juvenile court judge. Towards the end of 1969 or maybe early 70s, when I was doing this research, there wasn't a confirmed time as to when this budding relationship happened, but Carlos met Antonio Ibanez, who became his accomplice in many of the robberies that he would then go on to commit, as well as the homicides he would then go on to commit. In early 1971, Carlos and Antonio committed at least 4 robberies, stealing millions of pesos and spending them on luxury items for themselves. They were then arrested in January of 1971 for one of these crimes. So they did this all in 1 month, and then they were charged with felonies. Carlos was shortly released afterwards, but then he was ordered to present himself to court for another court appearance. Carlos and Antonio, who had also been released around the same time, he had been released on bail. They escaped to Mar del Plata on a train. So they're not really going to be accountable for the crimes that they're going to commit. They have both been released on bail, and instead of waiting around and, you know, being somewhat decent citizens and taking the judgment that is owed to them, they decide that they're going to get out of Dodge and go somewhere else. So then comes the crime spree and what is their modus operandi. Between 1971 and 1972, at just 19 years old, Carlos committed 11 homicides, often targeting acquaintances and displaying an extreme lack of remorse. Now, if you have seen my psychopath versus sociopath video, you will get some hints as to where Mr. Puch Robledo, where he sits in that, which bucket he sits in. Carlos and Antonio, who at the time lived in Tigre, Villa Adelina, were then on the hunt for a victim, and they committed their first homicide in March 1971. So very shortly after they was released on bail. This homicide, Carlos and Antonio entered an auto repair shop in Vicente Lopez around midnight in the northern Greater Buenos Aires area, and they unalived the shop owner and seriously injured and assaulted his wife, who did survive along with her 10-month-old baby. They got away with $400,000 Argentinian dollars worth of cash. And even though the baby survived, Carlos did actually aim at the baby's cradle in a failing attempt to unalive her, which is absolutely sick. And I don't understand, like, his background, there wasn't enough in there to see where this sadistic personality came from. It just did, yeah. 11 days later, in May of 1971, Carlos and Antonio broke into a nightclub in Olivos where they stole more than 2 million pesos in cash from the storage room before fleeing. Then, as they were trying to make their escape, Carlos opened a door into a small room, and when he looked inside, he saw 2 men sleeping who were the watchmen, and he immediately opened fire on them, unaliving both of them at the time. Now, that caused a question. Again, the sedition behind it. They were asleep. They didn't even notice he was there, and he still killed them anyway. It just doesn't really make sense. 10 days later, all this is happening in May of 1971, Carlos and Antonio then entered a supermarket in Vicente Lopez, and once they were inside this supermarket, Carlos shot and killed the 61-year-old watchman. He then stole more than 5 million pesos and drank a whole bottle of whiskey with Antonio at the crime scene in celebration of their homicidal success. In June 1971, the manic pair then kidnapped a 16-year-old girl from the Buenos Aires highway, and the girl had been involved in Lady of the Night work, and she was forced into Carlos's car at gunpoint. And after driving to a secluded area, Antonio essayed the girl and then ordered her out of the car. That has been disputed, and it's been said that it was Carlos. So one of them assaulted the girl and then ordered her out of the car, and then Carlos tells her to walk away without looking backwards, and as she is walking away, he unloaded his weapon 5 times into her back, unaliving her. And it's, again, like I said, it's unclear whether Carlos participated in the essay. He then unalived another female on the 24th of June 1971 when, again with his homicidal best friend, they kidnapped 22-year-old woman who had left her boyfriend's house near the site where the 16-year-old had been unalived. And the pair then drove this 22-year-old woman to another secluded area. And again, it said that Antonio was the one that committed an essay on the woman. Again, Antonio ordered the woman out of the car, and Carlos followed her, unloading his weapon multiple times in her back, unaliving her. They couldn't face their victims, it seems. They would like them sleeping, not looking at them, turn away. They were just cowardly little men. On the 5th of August 1971, Antonio actually died in a confusing car incident that occurred while Carlos was driving. And the rumours are that Carlos could have killed Antonio Ibanez and staged it as an accident, as an alibi for Antonio Ibanez's homicide. However, there is no evidence, clear evidence, that Carlos was responsible for the death of Antonio Ibanez. So it was marked as an accidental death, and because he no longer had a homicidal best friend, what does Carlos do? He just looks for another accomplice, finally acquainting himself with Hector Somoza, again to go on this ridiculous murderous rampage. And the two committed their first crime together on the 15th of November 1971 when they entered a supermarket in the northern area of the Greater Buenos Aires, and the pair didn't actually take anything, as Carlos was surprised by the 50-year-old watchman whom he ended up unaliving by shooting him multiple times. 2 days after this incident, Carlos and Somoza then broke into an auto agency and stole 90,000 Argentinian dollars in cash. Before fleeing, Carlos unalived the sleeping watchmen. Again, they were sleeping. Why are all the watchmen sleeping? Why are they not supposed to be on the watch, which means they're supposed to be awake, watching, seeing what's happening? Danger, danger, danger. No. Again, these watchmen were sleeping. I get that they're tired, but sleeping on the job, guys, like, really? So yeah, Carlos then unalived the sleeping watchman, and they had raised concerns in regards to the deaths of other watchmen in the area. At this point, the police then began to suspect that there was someone responsible for these serial homicides. On the 25th of November, when, along with his accomplice Somoza, he broke into a Dodge agency, they stole 1.5 million pesos. Before escaping, Carlos again took the watchmen to the second floor of the agency and unalived them by unloading his weapon multiple times into the watchman. The last homicide that Carlos would then go on to commit occurred on the 3rd of February 1972 when, along with his accomplice Somoza, he broke into a hardware store in Tigre, Buenos Aires. Once he made entry into the establishment, Carlos encountered the watchmen, who were awake this time, and at gunpoint he locked the men up in a small room. Minutes later, Carlos then returned, opened the door and aimed at them, and unfortunately unalived the men with 2 shots. After the watchmen were murdered, Carlos and Somoza tried to open the safe vault. In what was somewhat of a confusing interaction between Carlos and Somoza, Carlos unalived Somoza because Somoza grabbed Carlos, and Carlos took that as he was attempting to kill him. So he was attempting to attack him. So then Carlos took his handgun and shot Somoza, unaliving him. So that's 2 accomplices that he's now unalived. Carlos then tried to cover up Somoza's identity by burning his face and hands with a blowtorch. Where he got the blowtorch from, well, he was in an establishment that probably had that kind of stuff. Maybe that's where he found it. Otherwise, where would he just randomly find a blowtorch? Yeah. But in order to conceal the identity of his accomplice, he took the blowtorch to his face and hands, and then he escaped with some cash, but forgot that he had Somoza's identification card, his ID card, in his pockets. So, clarification. Somoza had Carlos Puch's identity card in his pocket. So he had left the burning body with his clear identification in his pocket, which eventually led to Carlos's arrest. And he was arrested on the 4th of February 1972, just one day after the incident in the establishment. And he was arrested because Carlos's identity card was found in Somoza's trouser pockets, or the pants pockets, which made the police interview his family, who had said that Somoza had been spending a lot of time with Carlos lately, and he had just turned 20, so he was quite easily manipulated maybe into being in this homicidal relationship with Carlos. Carlos's arrest on February the 4th, 1972 was the result of a series of violent crimes. They were on the radar of the police at the point of the second or third watchman that got unalived. And these violent crimes did escalate over time, where it was just glaringly obvious to the police that there had to be at least one consistent person involved in these crimes. And the key events that led up to the Angel of Death's capture were his 11 homicides, 7 robberies, multiple grapes, which, again, there's not confirmation that he committed the grapes and SAs. However, he was guilty by association, even if he wasn't involved in the actual acts himself. In 1973, however, he escaped from Unit 9 in La Plata, but when he was recaptured and taken to the Sierra Chica prison, he is currently still residing there today in Hall 10 for homosexuals. Now, this is why I think there is that grey area as to whether he was or wasn't involved in the assaults on the women, because it's very clear that Antonio did engage in those assaults. However, it's also very clear that Carlos is gay, so he potentially may not have committed them, but again, guilty by association. After his arrest for the serial homicides, his grandmother suddenly died and his mother attempted to unalive herself. And his father allegedly blamed Carlos for these incidents, which Carlos never forgave his father for making those statements and those assumptions. However, his father is well within his right to put that on him, and it can be argued that probably the mum wouldn't have tried to unalive herself, especially given the fact that she had given so much care and she wasn't like the general mothers we've seen on some of these cases that have they're either indifferent to the abuse that the father's giving, or they just are so disengaged as mothers from their children. She really was involved positively in her son's upbringing. And after his capture, Carlos threatened his father via letter, telling him that he would unalive him the day he was freed. So, I mean, he's sick, he's twisted, and his father is well within his right to make those assumptions that he is responsible for the death of the grandma and the what could have been the death of the mother. However, Carlos's father divorced Carlos's mother, and he was actually fired from his job due to the ostracization for his son's actions. So again, the father is still reaping the sowing of his son, because his son committed these homicides, his son committed these essays, his son committed the grapes. But because of the stigma behind this, the father was getting the backlash for it. So he ended up losing his job and divorcing his wife. Carlos's trial began 8 years after his arrest on the 4th of August 1980, where he faced 36 charges, including the 11 counts of aggravated homicide. And he first blamed his accomplices, Ibanez, of the crimes, and he stood defiant in court, where he referred to the whole process as a farce. The trial was extended for 4 months, where there were 92 witnesses who had accused Carlos of committing the crime. Prior and during the whole process, a forensic psychiatrist called Osvaldo Raffo determined that Carlos was a psychopath who presented a threat to society. Again, if you have seen this video, you probably came to that conclusion yourself, because he exhibited a lot of the traits of a psychopath. He had no empathy. He was emotionally detached. He was kind of manipulative of his accomplices. And could we potentially say that there was a bit of control in getting rid of them, because they also both died at his hand? So I'll leave that to you to let me know what you think in the comments. Carlos, who met with Raffo over 25 times during the evaluations, later accused Raffo of lying and gaining fame at his expense. On the 27th of November 1980, the trial concluded with a unanimous verdict from the 3 presiding judges. Carlos Eduardo Robledo Puch was sentenced to life with the accessory of determinate reclusion, which is the maximum possible sentence that you can get under Argentinian law. After the verdict was read, Carlos delivered his last words to the court, saying, "This was a Roman circus. I was judged and sentenced beforehand." Very interesting, Carlos, because you're a homicidal maniac. But that was subjective, what I just said. It wasn't objective, but that's how I feel. But my feelings don't matter when it comes to academic lenses. So Carlos later denied his involvement in the homicide that he was accused of, saying that he was tortured and coerced into confessing to these homicides. He didn't deny any of the thefts, though. He actually held his hand up and said, "Yep, those were me." And it's interesting he admits to the robberies and not the homicides, even though most of the homicides were linked to the robberies. The only survivor who didn't appear or testify in court for health reasons said that the man who had raped and shot her had long hair, which indicated that Antonio Ibanez was the culprit, because Robledo Carlos had short curly hair, which we kind of knew, but they also didn't know who shot them because they were running away. So definitely Ibanez was the one who was responsible for the assault, but the shooting, I'm still of the belief that that was Carlos. On the 7th of July 1973, Carlos briefly escaped from prison, but was promptly recaptured 3 days later in downtown Buenos Aires. His mother, who appeared in the media defending her son and denying that he had committed any of these homicides, was confronted by angry reporters who asked her if she believed in her son's innocence. She responded and said that she knew that her son had done some things, but not all of them. That was a quote. Her son had done some things, but not all of them. Ignorance is bliss, I guess. In April 2017, Carlos told reporter Rodolfo Palacios that in 1982 he had sent a personal letter to then facto leader Leopold Galtieri and offered to volunteer as a soldier in the Falklands War, but Carlos never received a response from Galtieri. In July 2000, he became eligible for parole, but he did not submit a petition. In 2003, he was briefly transferred to a psychiatric hospital where he was evaluated after he dressed as Batman and set fire to a workshop in the prison where he was serving. And after being found competent, he was promptly returned back to that prison. In 2007, he was transferred to another prison in Azul, Buenos Aires. On the 27th of May 2008, he submitted a petition request to be paroled. The judge who reviewed the petition denied him parole, considering him to still be a threat to society. Then in November 2013, he requested a review of his sentence, or failing that, his execution by lethal injection. He had enough in prison. He wanted out either way, either let me free or let me free, to, even though it's actually illegal in Argentina to carry out the death penalty. They have no death penalty in Argentina. So the fact that he'd asked for the lethal injection, he must have known it was going to get denied. The Supreme Court of Justice denied both of those requests. He was not going to be set free and he was not going to be put to death. And the request for execution was highlighted as being illegal. Again, on the 27th of March 2015, the Supreme Court Justice rejected an appeal filed by Carlos against the aforementioned judicial decision. So the decision where his parole was denied and he also wanted the lethal injection, he filed an appeal again for that. That went nowhere. In May 2019, Carlos was rushed into hospital from prison after he showed signs of intoxication related to side effects of a medication that was aimed to treat depression. So somewhere along the lines, I think they possibly reviewed his mental health and thought maybe he was suffering with depression and therefore prescribed him medication for this, which he tried to unalive himself with. Allegedly. In March 2023, during an interview with America 24, Carlos denies his crimes and blamed others for them. He said that he was constantly suffering in prison and that he wished to be euthanized. This man holds no accountability, clear psychopath, because they do not hold any accountability. They have these grandiose views of their self-worth, and where they can, they will apportion blame to someone else. So he cannot see himself responsible for any of the crimes that he's being blamed for. In June 2023, Oscar Roberto Quintana of the Court of Guarantees and Appeals turned down his parole request, once again citing that Carlos suffers from inconsistent emotions, could be expressed in an erratic way, adding that Carlos has paranoid reflections. The judge also rejected the transfer to a nursing home which had been requested, saying that Carlos refuses psychiatric treatment and that he has not worked since 1992. I don't know where the working comes in, but I understand why he denied request for going to a nursing home. In November of 2024, so just last year, Judge Quintana offered Carlos the possibility of having more relaxed prison conditions, which included going outside of the penitentiary for a few hours. However, given all of the times that he had requested parole and wanted freedom, he denied and rejected the proposal, saying that he was used to living in prison. I mean, he has been in there since 1980, so 40 plus years incarcerated. He's been in there longer than he was out of prison, given the fact that he went in when he was 20. So in March of this year, Carlos gave another interview where he asked once more to be executed via lethal injection. It is still illegal to deliver the death penalty in Argentina. So again, just away with the fairies. As of 2025, Carlos has spent over 53 years in prison, making him the longest serving prisoner in South America. Yep, scratch that, because his trial started in 1980, but he was caught in 1973. That's a long time. He has been extensively evaluated over the years, and in November of 2024, mental health professionals issued a profile to Judge Quintana, who had decided whether to grant him full parole, which obviously we know was denied on the basis of that evaluation. And what the psychologist found was that Carlos was suffering from a psychopathic personality. So we've seen that he's a psychopath, and they've documented that he was suffering from psychopathic personality disorder with significant omnipotence of narcissism. He is a narcissist. He has large amounts of rage. He's emotional superficiality, impulsivity, and absence of introspection, repressed emotionality, megalomaniac ideation, and paranoia and lack of self-control meant that the judge said, absolutely not, this man is never getting released from prison. He can stay there. Maybe he can go for walks once in a while. But Carlos said, I can't be bothered to do that. I've been in prison long enough and I'm used to being in prison, even though he then asked to be euthanized. So he has clearly been identified as a psychopath. It's been documented. So it begs the question, incarceration seems to have been the answer for him. However, 53 years of incarceration from the age of 20. Yeah. So the case of Carlos Puch can be examined through several academic lenses, including criminology, psychology, and sociology. From a criminological perspective, the early signs of antisocial behavior that were evident, with probably being the response to being bullied, where he then became the thief. His progression, theft to violent crimes, and his eventual capture and trial provides a comprehensive case study on the development and escalation of criminal behavior, because he didn't have that much of a dramatically awful childhood compared to some of the other cases that we've looked at. Yes, his father wasn't really, the relationship with his father wasn't there, and we can see that throughout up until his adulthood, where he even threatened to unalive his father. But other than that, he did not have some of the experiences that other cases that we've reviewed have had. However, this lens can help us analyze the factors that contribute to the person's descent into criminality and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in addressing such cases. However, because so many of these things happen in so many different countries, for example, this case is in Argentina. Most of the cases we've looked at so far have been in the United States of America, and some of the other cases that we'll cover may be in the UK and other places. So there are so many different criminal justice systems with their own rules and laws. Many people will look at this case and say his criminal offences, especially the homicides, mean that he should have been given the death penalty. And he himself is asking for the lethal injection. However, in Argentina, that's illegal. If this case had happened in the US, in a state that allowed for the death penalty to be put on the table, could we argue and say he possibly wouldn't have spent 53 years in prison? Because we also know people that tended to be given the death penalty back in the 70s and 80s, their punishments seem to be carried out quite promptly. Ted Bundy, I think he served 4 years before being executed, and many of the other cases, don't quote me, that it might have been longer than 4 years, and some of the other cases, they all seem to, okay, we've gotten a confession from you, we've got from you what we needed, and their execution is swift. Years later, 90s to the noughties, they don't really seem to be as swift as they were before. There's people that are sitting on death row and have been for like the last 20 years. However, he committed these homicides in the 70s. So if this had happened in one of the states that allow for the death penalty, could it be argued that his behaviour possibly would have gotten him a first way ticket to death row? I'll let you answer that in the comments. Then when we look at it through a psychological lens, Carlos's actions can be examined through in terms of the psychopathy and other personality disorders. We've already done this in one of my other videos, psychopath versus sociopath, where you can see the clear distinction between the two pathologies. However, his lack of remorse, his violent tendencies, and his manipulative behaviour were obviously clear indicators of the psychopathic trait. However, he also seemed to demonstrate some sociopathic traits, such as the impulsivity and the acting out of emotion, even though he was emotionally detached. So there is room for the argument as to, we know he's been labelled a psychopath, but why? What happened in his early years, in his formative years, that allowed the development of the psychopath? Because we know psychopathic traits are more neurological, whereas sociopath is more environmental. It's based on behaviors and environment during the formative years. So you can have a look at it in that sense. These perspectives can offer insight into the mental health issues that may underlie such extreme behaviors and the importance of early psychological intervention. At some point, he was probably diagnosed with depression, hence why he tried to OD with the medication that was given for depression. It may not have been for depression, maybe it was for anxiety, but we know that psychopaths can't feel anxiety. So I don't know why he would have that medication. Maybe he stole it from someone else. Who knows? But it opens the door for those conversations. And then you've got the sociological perspective, which we can focus on the societal and familial influences on Carlos's development. His troubled relationship with his father, the experiences of bullying, and the impact of his crimes on his family and community highlight the role of the social environment in shaping behaviour. Did the lack of engagement from his father, the bullying, and the impact that his crimes had on his family exacerbate how he acted in his other crimes? He killed without thought, and he tended to always get someone in a very vulnerable position. 2, 3, 4 watchmen that were sleeping, the women were running away, he'd shoot them in the back. He wasn't very confrontational. This lens can help us understand how societal factors contribute to the emergence of criminal behaviour and the broader implications for social policy and interpretation. But each of these lenses, the sociological, criminological, and psychological lenses, provide a different angle on this case. Again, none of these lenses are there to justify his actions. They're there to give a perspective on the case and the situations that are presented. And the different angles of the case that it gives contributes to a holistic understanding of Carlos Robledo Puch's life and crimes. Carlos Robledo Puch's case underscores the critical need to identify and address antisocial behaviour in youth. But how can society better detect and intervene before such individuals escalate to? That is a question I'll leave for you to answer in the comments. And as we close off today's exploration of Carlos, it's very clear that his story is a complex tapestry woven from various psychological, sociological, and criminological and legal threads. Even though we haven't explored as much of his childhood as we possibly could, because in all fairness, I couldn't find much of his childhood other than the fact that he was bullied, his mum loved him lots, and his dad wasn't really engaged with him. There wasn't much that showed some of the environmental influence from the family, but we do know he was bullied. However, many people are bullied and don't turn into Carlos Puch. So it's given us an interesting insight into those aspects of his life. Each perspective has offered a unique insight into the factors that possibly shaped his path and the broad implications for society. And as always, thank you for joining me on today's deep dive into one of the most notorious criminal cases in Argentinian history, the case of the Angel of Death, or the Black Angel. If you found this video informative and you like true crime as I like true crime, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime content. Stay curious, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. Carlos Eduardo, what was his name? Carlos Eduardo Robledo, Jesucristo, began to suspect what? Whose youthful facade was masked, whose Lord have mercy. He is a narcissist. Oh my days, the words aren't coming out.